are talking in the shadows. And this is directed and written by Glenn Martin and stars genre favourite Michael Paré. It is a low-budget slasher movie, I would say, definitely influenced by slasher movies of the past, in particular Halloween and The Town That Dreaded Sundown, to name probably two. It is a low-budget movie. What is the story? Well, it primarily focuses on this young girl who has a kind of extended family that we meet in the movie. And she's just living her best life, but her and her family are going to be menaced from a masked lunatic that has escaped from an asylum. And this guy's actually a member of her extended family, and he wants revenge for being locked up all those years before, and essentially seeks to eliminate his family and anyone else that comes into his way. To try and stop him, we've got Michael Paré's cop character, who is on the case with a kind of a Dr. Loomis kind of style kind of sidekick. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So let us discuss what I think works. Now, this is a low budget movie. You could just tell the first few frames when you're watching it. The quality of the camera and the production, it looks low budget. And you've seen some of these kind of amateurish productions, you know, before if you've watched this kind of channel. But I would say this actually has some pretty good elements in it. Primarily for me, I was surprised how strong the acting was. It's actually pretty good. I would say 80% of the performances here are actually far better than the majority of movies that I've seen for around this kind of budget. The characters seemed real, the performances seemed realistic, the interactions and the kind of the relationships between these characters seemed authentic. I was very impressed actually with the majority of the cast here for giving realistic performances that really felt quite grounded. In actual fact, I would say it's Michael Paré who's the biggest name here, who kind of gives that more stereotypical kind of movie kind of style kind of dialogue here, and kind of certainly kind of acts more like your you know, the typical. There are a few other examples, but the bulk of the cast, and Michael Paré doesn't do a bad job. He just kind of seems like, you know, very much like a kind of a less than dramatic actor, shall we say. Whilst I'd say a lot of the other kind of the work here in the acting seems more like a kind of a dramatic kind of style acting, and as I say, it seems kind of very authentic in many ways. So I was quite impressed. And the dialogue scenes, for example, where we have our, you know, our kind of characters interacting, like our main character, this girl, how she interacts with her family, how she interacts with her friends, and how they interact back with her. I all thought, man, that's actually some pretty good, realistic kind of dialogue, but it doesn't feel improvised. You know, it feels like, well, maybe quasi-improvised possibly, but it just feels like it's a well put together dramatic scene. Time has been taken by this director to get a good performance from the cast, and the cast have responded by doing a good job and good performances, so that's very good. Now, despite its low budget look, the movie is actually kind of relatively kind of well put together outside of that. I mean, yes, the low budget does show. In particular, you know, just some of the kind of the quality of, as I say, the camera work, some of the transitions and things like that. But nonetheless, you know, it's relatively well edited and kind of put together in a kind of like a framing, you know, sort of point of view and things like this. You know, cinematography is a bit of a mixed bag, but, you know, I can see some positives in this. You know, how this kind of killer is largely kind of kept in darkness. You know, it is kind of following the Halloween playbook in a lot of ways, but nonetheless, it gives this killer a certain mystique. Kind of, you know, he's standing further away. He's sometimes obscured by kind of like, you know, bushes or something, or he's kind of kept in the dark. He's not overly kind of like designed in that he's basically just kind of wearing like a burlap kind of sack on his head, for example, so it doesn't seem like, you know, an overly designed horror mask and things. So he kind of looks more sort of practical, so to speak. There's a relatively kind of high body count in this one, and for a large part of this movie it kind of feels a little bit more like a police procedural. Again, there's budgetary restrictions that you're gonna point out if you watch this movie and be too nitpicky on. I'm going to give you a couple in a minute, but just the kind of the way, for example, some of the dialogue is kind of said, the kind of the thoughtfulness and the kind of the slow kind of like police machine that kind of chugs along the court scene, for example, I thought was all pretty good. What doesn't work, so let me just kind of go back to some of the kind of what I was saying here. I mean, like the budget kind of shows through, but also some of the kind of like maybe the lack of kind of attention to detail a little bit. For example, there's a crime scene where we have a body being, examined by a police detective. She's not even wearing rubber gloves, she's just kind of there like doing her thing without any type of rubber gloves or anything like that. There's a scene where a character from her house is calling the police, and then we kind of see the kind of like the shots between her and this police like reception woman. And they've got the same backgrounds, you can see the same wooden slatted wall behind it. So it looks like they've just been filmed in like different parts of the same room, or different part of the same house or something. So there's really some kind of like obvious kind of a budget kind of shortcuts, not just the kind of the kind of the look of the camera and the kind of the kind of the way this kind of film is presented. It does look cheap, but there are some kind of shortcuts that are made. So you can kind of definitely kind of see this. The movie does have a relatively high body count, but it's strangely not particularly gory. Maybe this was a route they could have gone down to make this a little bit more shocking. It is, I really have to say, it's played very much like Halloween, because that wasn't a particularly gory film, and I feel like this movie is trying to emulate that, but obviously Halloween, we've all seen that, so it's kind of like... This doesn't quite have that fear factor that Halloween does, and maybe they could have, lent into maybe a bit more of a gore. Again, it might have been down to a budget. They just simply didn't have the money to make a prosthetic, dummy head, so when an axe hits, you can see it go, and it's all very much like, edited away, or the kills are slightly off screen, or something like that. So it's a largely sort of bloodless affair, despite it being a relatively kind of high kind of body count. As much as I like the practical look of the mask, it kind of looks like just this sack. There are some elements where I feel it didn't quite work for me. Like it has these eye holes, and they're just like real small. And it's just like, how's this guy going to see out that? Realistically, how's he going to get around and kind of see out this? And then we see him like breathe, and he's clearly like out of breath, and he's like, the mask is like compressing and decompressing, like where he's breathing, and I think again it could have been slightly better kind of like put together. I have to be honest with you, I think the movie's pace is, as I've mentioned, a little bit like a procedural, so it doesn't get particularly exciting at times. I would say this movie is a little bit low energy. I mean, there is a high body count, and we do see the killer, a reasonable amount, but I didn't really feel like it was particularly kind of visceral. It all feels a little bit kind of like low energy is the best way I'll describe it, and a little bit kind of like ends up being... Dull's too much of a strong word, because I wouldn't say this movie is dull, but it just seems a little bit muted, a little bit subdued, not quite as kind of like killer instinct as one might want from a psychopathic slasher movie. It doesn't have that kind of that bloodthirsty kind of like shock factor that I feel a movie like this would have, and ultimately you'd want from that. So it's a fine movie if you don't mind a low budget, and it clearly has restrictions. I think it's probably worth checking out. The overall product, I don't think it's a brilliant movie. It's okay, but I will say I was pretty impressed, I say, with the performances. So because of the performances, I'm actually going to give this a slightly above average score, although I think it's kind of an average film. But to me, the acting in it it's certainly for the kind of level of this film, the budget, the kind of the the production values, the acting and the character work here was a touch above average. So I'm going to reward that by giving it a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Please do let me know, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.